We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Calls for remaking America's gun laws come fast and furious after the shootings in Texas and Buffalo. But will these proposed laws actually do any good for anyone? Well, perhaps a look at the history and the laws that did make it through Congress can provide a clue. Well, we're joined by Scott Cosenza, Esquire, lawyer, host of the Uprising podcast, and general man about town, who has dug deep into such laws and is here to enlighten us. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. A pleasure.
So, Scott, you've looked into the laws passed in reaction to school shootings throughout the years, and whether they would have actually worked to prevent that particular crime. Now, I suspect that we all know what the answer is going to be here, but give me a breakdown of your top two favorites.
Well, federal firearms regulation has followed this, this pattern. That perhaps the most impactful regulation is the Firearms Act of 1968, which was proposed in the wake of John F. Kennedy's assassination, and then passed in the wake of his brother's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination. King and Bobby were both shot with domestically produced firearms, a Remington rifle and a Ivor Johnson handgun. In those cases, JFK was shot with a rifle that was imported and sold via mail order. And so that subjected to multiple potential opportunities for federal legislation. At the time, they didn't think they could just legislate, banning of guns. So they took the basically that it had traveled in interstate commerce, and that was able for them to ban mail order rifles. But Oswald could have bought that rifle or a different rifle that would be, in fact, of increased functionality locally. He just chose that for the same reason that people choose to buy imports of anything from cars to shoes, that the different variety and often cheaper prices. So that wouldn't have made a difference. The assault weapons ban of 1994 is perhaps the next biggest one.
That is probably the most famous one, especially in the light of recent things with Joe Biden saying that.
It's most famously known, but it's not actually most impactful in actually how guns are sold in commerce, both at the wholesale and the retail level. That would be the 1968 law.
I believe we're going to get into it wasn't that effective in terms of its effect either.
Well, yeah, of course. No, look, guns are ubiquitous. And the other thing, Mark, anything that we discuss has to be, I think, couched with the mind towards if we're not actually going to try to address why these shooters do their shootings and the hateful mind and, if you want to say, soul that they have, what's going to happen when in a very few short years we have printable guns that are completely unable to be controlled by the government? That's where we're headed. We're almost there with 3D printed guns, and it's only a matter of a few years before these are a reality. And so all these things that we're talking about just kind of don't matter when it comes to these regulations, because it won't be whether or not a person can get a gun. It will be, can they get their hands on a printer that's capable of making a gun? And for people with some money to burn, that's almost certainly going to be a yes.
Scott, I think it's worth pointing out that there's no mention in the Constitution of people being allowed 3D printers. So,
yeah, I suppose you're right. Well, we'll see about that one.
So let's get back to this 1994 assault weapons ban.
And that was passed in the wake of a few tragedies. Including the Stockton schoolyard massacre, kind of were the impetus of that. And I think it's helpful for people who aren't in the gun culture to argue by analogy. And just if for instance, I may have even discussed this before on LN Radio, which is if we use like sports cars and we say, sports cars are a real problem with people speeding up and down the road, so we're going to ban the Chevy Corvette. And they say, okay, the Corvette is now called the X-Speeder car. Well, if you ban these things by name, which is what the assault weapons ban of 1994 did, it banned a number of firearms by name. And you can imagine the day after the ban was placed, the manufacturers just said, this is no longer an AR-15, it's an AR-15 plus one, right? And then
they're calling in the madmen to do the advertising, right?
And the other thing that it did was effectively drive up the prices of many of these things. So, for instance, it also banned the production of full-size ammunition magazines, those that can hold more than 10 rounds. But it didn't ban the possession of those that held more than 10 rounds, Mark. It just banned the manufacture. So all those who had existing stock and inventory, they basically just got a free gift from the government that their property was now worth more because supply and demand.
It was
right?
the Bitcoin of 1994.
Well, not quite, but yeah. So again, all that does is prevent somebody who doesn't have $100 from buying a magazine rather than the true cost, which would have been $15 or $20. Without the ban in place.
Now,
So
Scott,
again,
I know you don't like to do theoreticals here, Scott, but is it possible that somebody who was looking to acquire a higher capacity magazine for criminal purpose would be adverse to stealing that money to buy the higher capacity magazine?
not only that, we don't have any notion that they would need to. And what I mean by that is that, for instance, the murderer of Uvalde, Texas, he didn't just buy an AR-15. He bought what would be like the BMW of AR-15s, Mark, a couple $1,000s worth. So it's not even the case that the need to scrape the bottom of the barrel cost-wise. Now that's sort of more indicative of what we see cheap guns in maybe fueling violence in like Chicago and Philly, the kind of like teenagers, urban teenagers who don't have that kind of dough. But I don't know where this kid got his money from, but he obviously had plenty to buy a really nice AR-15, and one that, increasing the cost by some small measure would not have made a difference.
Okay, so obviously we've looked at these two specific instances, but obviously in your research you've looked at many more. And have you found instances where gun laws passed in the wake of a specific tragedy would have prevented that tragedy? Or is it by and large a case that they're completely missing the mark every time?
Well, they're missing the mark every time, and here's why. Even if the law itself would have prevented that specific mechanism by which the shooter bought or acquired their firearm, it would only have prevented it if you then would say that they would have stopped there and wouldn't have taken ordinary means to accomplish their goal otherwise. So if, for instance, we ban high capacity or full capacity magazines from being sold at the store, okay, would that have stopped somebody who bought a full capacity magazine at the store? Well, no, if they just simply would have gone on and bought one at a gun show or at on a classified ad or from eBay or any of the other legal ways they could have. So you'd have to literally take it out of the hands of all those possessors in order to prevent somebody from having it, for instance. You couldn't just ban production. The numbers that are already produced are so high, Mark, that all it will do is produce some price inflation, but availability will always be there.
I think a lot of people get hung up on the fact that this is guns, specifically politicians, whereas we know murder is possible not just with guns, but with, as we've seen here in Europe from 2015 onwards, people carrying out deadly attacks with vehicles. Most notably in France, in Nice, I believe that was.
You've got a real knife crime issue over there in the UK that we don't have.
Huge knife crime issue in the UK, specifically London, the big cities. And then,
much
of course,
like the US with our gun murders, by the way.
And then, of course, in China, where guns are very few and far between, you have people going into schools and stabbing children on rampages, and this is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and it's an issue. But the issue in these countries, France with trucks, the UK with knives, China with stabbing implements in schools, the issue is not the guns, it's people.
It is people, and without fixing the people, I don't know what you can do. There's a very natural kind of, I think, reaction when one confronts this level of heinous madness to do something. And that's a reaction we can all have and forgive in others. But to base public policy on just an emotional reaction to this without thinking it through and how it's going to affect people and will it yield a positive result or a negative one, I think is irresponsible. And one of the things we don't see on any of these is any ledger balance on the other side of the equation. a fantastically high number of children die each year by drowning in backyard swimming pools in America. It's a real tragedy. Is the answer then to, fill up with concrete every backyard swimming pool? It would certainly save, many families horrible tragedies. But we vote with, no, we have the freedom to do these things, and people, there's a certain amount of risk out there. And I would say that with respect to firearms, these guns are used as tools and for self-defense and for protecting our liberty. And it's tough to say that in the face of a schoolroom full of dead fourth graders, but it does need to be said, Mark.
And with that, Scott Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And we're almost done for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Dave Patterson, Jeff Charles, and Scott Cosenza, and of course you, the listeners, for being here with us. My final thoughts for this week. When politicians propose solutions that will likely as not either impact your rights or your wallet, they must be certain that their intended actions will have the desired outcome. As we've seen with almost every gun control measure so far, this has not been the case. And that begs a question. Why are politicians not held accountable for failed laws? Sure, voters can go to the ballot box, but without knowing that the legislation was an expensive failure, the voters can't be informed voters. A brave politician would outline precisely what factors would mean their legislation has failed before even putting it up to Congress. That way, the people would know for sure whether the law was a success or not. But as I say, that would require bravery. And that seems to be in very short supply in the corridors of power. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fighting for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.